next Wednesday will be the first test and the pass. The pass is a separate test. And I did say I wouldn't give study guides, but I've had these study guides given to me. So over the weekend, I put the pass study guide on iCollege. If you happen to be on iCollege since yesterday afternoon, that's when I put it on yesterday afternoon. If you happen to go on iCollege, you might have noticed it. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because you didn't expect to see it there. But nevertheless, the PASS study guides is on iCollege. The study guides give the difference between primary and secondary sources. And that's what the PASS is about, primary versus secondary. It's designed more for later history courses than this period, but nevertheless, it is applicable for this class also. All right, so much for that. The PASS will be 5 multiple choice questions, but you don't need a Scantron. Just put your answers on the page. And the other test is fill in the, actually I just put down a word and I want you to define the word. 25 words to define. Some of the definitions, I mean, I don't know if you'll, let me back up a bit. I made up 50 questions. I'm giving you 25 and the other class 25, so I don't know which ones you'll get, which ones they'll get. I don't know that off the top of my head, but if you see something on a test like, well, Pharaoh, all I ask you to do is put down the name of an Egyptian king. If you have anything close to that, I'll give you 4 points. Egyptian kings were called Pharaoh. Or if you see the word hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics. This is the term used for Egyptian writing. If you say anything that's close to, actually if all you put is Egyptian writing, I'll give you 4 points. Now some of the answers will be longer. Like, for instance, name 3 things that define a civilization. I gave you 5. If you could name 3 of them. Again, I don't know if you'll receive that on the test of the other class, but for some of them you'll need a little bit more than a short answer. For some answers, 1 word will do. Again, you do not need a Scantron. Not this time. Now, later in the semester you will. All right, any questions? Yes?
Will there be names of individuals on the test?
Yes, names like Nebuchadnezzar, Sargon, Hatshepsut. Now, I don't know if you'll get those names or not, but those names I can pretty well guarantee are on the test, at least for one of the classes. Yes?
Do we need to know, like, birth dates?
No, for one thing, the dating in the ancient world is very, very nebulous, as I'm going to emphasize. But your book says that Sargon lived around 1800 BCE. I'm not going to ask you that. You could put it down if you want to.
Each question is like 4 points.
Each question would be 4 points. Actually, there are 24 questions times 4, which means you get 4 points just for showing up. 24 questions. I said 25, but 24. You get 24. The other class gets 24. And the test questions will be jumbled up somewhat checkerboard style, or where what you get was the same questions are jumbled. So you'll be answering the same questions, but if you try to look on your neighbor's paper, I hate to mention stuff like that, but if you do, you're going to find that they are likely answering the questions in a different order than you are. So you're going to have a very difficult time deciphering anything from your neighbor's paper. In other words, I'll be looking at you, watching you for you. So I know you're all sitting close together. That's fine. But I'm going to dish out the papers checkerboard style as much as I can. Same questions, different order. You may leave when you're finished. That's on Wednesday. Now, there could be a glitch. I mean, I just turned in the test booklets to the print shop 30 minutes ago. If the print shop doesn't have them back to me by 8:30, we'll just have to put the test off the following Monday. That can happen. It shouldn't, but it can. All right. Any other questions? Okay. We'll move on. Egypt. Geography played a big role in the formation of Egypt, in that Egypt was isolated from the rest of the world at that time. On the south, it was isolated by a vast dry desert. To the north, it was isolated by the Red Mediterranean Sea. To the east, it was isolated by desert and by the Red Sea. And to the west, it was isolated by the world's largest desert, the Sahara. So Egypt was isolated. Nevertheless, that did not prevent trade. We do know that Egypt traded with Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia traded with Egypt. Mesopotamia, in fact, traded all the way with India, 1,000 miles away. So there was trade that went on. Egypt would have been nothing more than an extension of the Sahara Desert had it not been for the Nile River. Your book says the Nile is the world's largest river, going north for thousands of miles, and it's very, very wide. It would rise up every spring and overflow its banks and lay down a fresh new layer of topsoil. And then when the Nile had receded back to inside its banks, the people of Egypt would go out, plant their crops on fresh topsoil, and they would irrigate their crops by means of the river also. Since it seldom rained, crops had to be irrigated. And farmers in Egypt still farm this way, the way they've farmed for millennia. Egypt's history is divided by its dynasties. There's the first dynasty, so on, second dynasty, and so forth. Now, we are learning more about Egyptian history all the time. I may have mentioned this class. I was somewhat regretful to find out that we had not learned a whole lot about Mesopotamian history from the time I was in school till now. But in the case of Egypt, Egyptologists have gone in, and we now can name every pharaoh in every dynasty and tell what each of these dynasties tried to do and what each of these pharaohs tried to do. And we are trying our best to decipher a chronology. Now that's a real problem because we know the Egyptian scholars deliberately distorted their chronology in an attempt to make their country look older than it was. And they would put down pharaohs who they knew ruled at the same time, one pharaoh, one part of Egypt, one pharaoh over another. And they would make it look like they reigned not concurrently, but at one after the other, all in an attempt to inflate their history and make it older than it was. And this makes it very difficult to tell when, for instance, when the Bible refers to Pharaoh, well, which Pharaoh did Abraham meet? Then who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Which Pharaoh did Joseph meet? And so on and so forth. And because the Bible only refers to him as Pharaoh, we have a difficult time telling, but modern historians are going through and working on the issue. The problem is each one of them is coming up with a different name. The question of who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and each one of them have a different name. Again, a lot of this is just due to deliberate distortions on the part of the ancient Egyptian scribes. In addition to the dynasties, you have what's called three kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom goes back to the beginning of the Egyptian history, back to the first dynasty, and covers about the first 6 dynasties. In between these kingdoms were a period called intermediate. First intermediate, and second intermediate. The intermediate periods were periods of chaos. You had the Old Kingdom, then it was followed by a period of chaos. Then came the Middle Kingdom, and it was followed by a period of chaos. And then finally the New Kingdom. Now, the Egyptians did not like chaos because Egyptian climate is very, very regular and very predictable. The weather is always the same, day in and day out. The sky is always blue. Clouds are seldom seen. Rainfall rarely happens. So the Egyptians believed that this was the way that the universe should be ordered, everything regular and predictable, and some scholars have said that that was why their society was regular and predictable. Back when I was in school, there were a couple of books that talked about a society that was regulated and structured. Huxley's Brave New World, and another book, 1984, about a society where everybody was born into a certain mold, and they were to fit that mold all their lives, and nobody had any freedom. Some people believe that everybody in Egypt was a slave. Even the priests were slaves. Even the Pharaoh himself was a slave. Put in his role by the gods, and your whole life was structured, organized, regulated from the time you were born to the time you died. You were told what your profession was. You stayed in the profession of your parents. So if your father was a tanner, you'd be a tanner. If your father was a priest, you'd be a priest. If your father was a general, you'd have to be expected to become a general in Pharaoh's army. Everything was regulated, ordered. But there were periods of chaos, like everybody else. They'd have times when the old order would be shaken up and a new order would come on the scene. Now, here is the thing about Egyptian history, folk, that may appear to be backwards. The farther back you go, the more advanced they were. The pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom. They were not built in later times. During the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian pharaohs dug a canal between the Nile River and the Red Sea. That was the Old Kingdom. The later Egyptian pharaohs are not even able to keep the canal open. Parts of the canal still exist. I mean, in the land of Egypt, they have very regular order and not a whole lot of earthquakes or storms or things like that. But nevertheless, the canal silted over somehow, and later Egyptian pharaohs were not able to reopen it. Now, the pyramids. The most famous pyramid is the Pyramid of Khufu, or Cheops, sometimes called the Great Pyramid. Now, your book says, and the standard view is, that the pyramids were built as burial chambers for the pharaohs. I have a book in my house that says that there has never been a body found in any of the pyramids. And they say that instead the bodies were dug up from the pyramids and moved to the tomb of the kings far to the east of the Nile. Actually, no, to the west. To the valley on a cliff far to the west of the Nile. And all your kings are buried there. And most of the mummies we find are there, and the pyramids themselves do not contain any bodies. Which then leads us to wonder, well, if the pyramids were not burial grounds, what were they? Why were they built? Now, folk, some of you act like you have heard, and I've heard this too, that we, with our modern machinery and modern technology, could not build the Great Pyramid or could not duplicate the feat. The stones, some of the stones that were used in the building of the Great Pyramid are known to weigh 60 tons. And folks, 60-ton stones cannot be lifted by a team of men going heave and ho when a 40 says lift. Now, you can lift big stones that way. I mean, modern scientists, modern have seen it done, but people we call primitive, where they can lift some great stones, but 60 tons. And then to raise these stones, so the Great Pyramid is like 480 feet tall, to raise these stones 100 or more, 200 feet up in the air, you might think they would need a causeway. The problem is, all right, see, this is the pyramid. The causeway would have taken up more material than the pyramid itself. There's no evidence that there ever was a causeway. In other words, if there had been a causeway and the causeway had been taken away, where did the causeway disappear to? It could hardly have disappeared into thin air. There's no evidence that there ever was a causeway to get the stones elevated. According to Egyptian sources, the pyramid was built in 20 years with 2,300,000 stones. The crew would have had to lay a stone every second, 1 stone per second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to get the thing together in 20 years. Now, I'm not saying they didn't, but it would have taken some doing. The stones fit together so well you cannot get a knife in between them. How did they do it? Quite frankly, we don't know. I had a student ask me, do you have a rational explanation for how the pyramids are built? I said, I don't have one. Anybody have any comments? Question? Yes?
Isn't there like a hole towards the top?
Oh yeah, there's an entranceway in the Great Pyramid. An entranceway, you get certain distance and you go down the what's called the King's Passageway. Then the passageway goes up to the King's Chamber, and then below it there's a Queen's Chamber. There are passageways, at least one passageway in the pyramid. And inside the King's Chamber is what's called a sarcophagus. There have been persons who have gone great lengths to measure the sides of the pyramid, and we've discovered that the pyramid is the exact height. All right, if you took a spear, all right, this is not a good drawing. Let me see now. Let's say that this was half of a spear. The pyramid then is the exact height that it would be if this were half of a spear, if you follow the logic. The ratio of the 4 sides to twice the length from the ground to top, the ratio is pi, carried out in the 4th decimal place. Now, if any of you know anything about pi, it's a number that goes on and on and on. It starts out 3.14159265354. I believe those numbers are right. But pi was not carried out to the 4th decimal point until the 1600s. And yet, they knew it accurate to the 4 because some people believe that they intended to put the circle, the triangle, and the square all in one geometric form, using highly advanced mathematics and highly advanced geometry. Now, if that pyramid were the only one there is, but it isn't, in the rest of Egypt there are at least 100 pyramids that still stand. Not to mention go farther south into the land of Axum, and they built pyramids also, but theirs were only 6 feet or so tall. Pyramids are found all over the globe. They're found in China, in India, and in Central America. The Great Pyramid is not, it's the world's tallest pyramid, but it's not the biggest. The biggest pyramid is found in Capan, built by the Mayans. The Capan pyramid, though, is made of earth. It scatters out more than the Great Pyramid. It's not as tall as scale, so it has more volume than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. What was the fascination these people had for the pyramid shape? Again, some folks say it was a giant capacitor. If any of you know anything about electricity, capacitor will store electricity to where you can release it. Then there are stories that anything, if you put a razor blade inside a pyramid-shaped object, the blade will never lose its sharpness. If you put a dead animal inside a pyramid shape, the animal will not decay. Any of you heard any of these stories by any chance? You haven't? These stories are told. Again, the book I have is Peter Tompkins' Secrets of the Great Pyramid. To me, it's proof. I mean, all right, I had one person on the internet ask me one time, do you have any hard evidence for what you're saying? I said, well, how hard of evidence are the pyramids? I mean, that might have been a pun of sorts, but nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make, folks, is these people, the farther back you go, the more advanced they are, and the closer you come to modern times, the more primitive they become. It almost looks as if human history went from really high down lower, and only in modern times have we begun to climb back up. But you notice I put the ancients higher than I do the present. In consistence with my belief that ancient man might have been more advanced than we are. Bigger, stronger, perhaps more intelligent. And then as time went on, he lost a lot of his intelligence. There have been many books written on this subject. One of them entitled, We Are Not the First. Many a book written on the subject. And the ancients knew about nickel plating. You might notice nickel plating is done on like trombone mouthpieces, trumpet mouthpieces. Well, nickel plating can only be done. It's where you put a nickel coat on another type of metal, steel or iron or whatever. Nickel plating can only be done with electric current flow. It cannot be done with just dabbing a bunch of nickel, liquid nickel on another kind of metal. It can only be done with electric current. These people knew about nickel plating. Did they have electricity? Yes, we have found vases, jars that appear to be a battery. The most famous one being the Baghdad battery. And indicating, I mean, there have been many a book written on this subject indicating that these people were very highly advanced, and somewhere along the way, they lost their advancement. All right. Believe me, I could spend a whole lot more time talking about this. A lot of people have spent their entire lives, and in some cases their entire fortunes, investigating this. Napoleon Bonaparte went to the pyramid, and he calculated that there were enough stones in the Great Pyramid to encircle the nation of France 3 times. You could put 3 on top of each other. They would encircle the entire country of France. And also, man, if this sounds weird, I'm sorry, but I had a student do a paper on this topic just last semester. Napoleon entered a pyramid, went alone, came back out white as a ghost. And they asked him, what happened to you? Would not talk. On his deathbed, he started to talk, then he said, oh no, you wouldn't believe it. And he died without ever revealing what had happened to him. Anyway, that's as much of that as I want to get into. I mean, again, there are books written on the topic. There's a lot to be said about the topic. Again, it makes me wonder if the Pyramid Project, an attempt to continue the Tower of Babel project, which failed. Now, folks, this is just an ordinary American $1 bill. On the back side of it, you have what? Anybody know? The Great Pyramid. Anybody know what an Egyptian symbol is doing on American? This symbol, by the way, has been on the back of this dollar since the 1700s. If you don't have any idea, I don't either, but there have been theories. And one of them is that the pyramid was not finished, and the United States was a nation that was destined to finish what they didn't do. At the top of the pyramid is the all-seeing eye. The top of the pyramid is detached from the rest of the pyramid. I have to stop right there. There's more I could say about that topic, but the pyramid is the Masons have a very, very strong attachment to the pyramid shape. And all our founding fathers were Masons. This, folk, you can find out if you check the records. All right. Anyway, during the Old Kingdom, the big canal was built, the pyramids were built. You had a period of chaos followed by a middle kingdom, which was never as great as the first kingdom. Again, the Egyptians were great builders of temples, temples and palaces. All right. The Egyptian priests, they had a class of people they called priests, and they were a caste. In other words, you only could get to be a priest for being born into it. By the way, the Hebrews did the same thing. But they were not just priests in the sense that they performed only religious functions. Actually, to some extent, they were scientists. They were the priest, the scientist, the scholars, the scribes, the record keepers, the historians. All your educated people combined into one, and they are believed to have taken Egyptian history, altered it to suit their favor, and distorted it somewhat. Part of it to make Egypt look older than it was. And this is a trend that you find among modern scholars, to make the universe older than what religion says it is, billions and billions of years. The Egyptians did not add billions of years, but they tried to add to the age of their country to try to make it look like Egypt was created first. And Egypt was made perfect, then the gods created the rest of the world as an afterthought. With the case of the Egyptians, you had, of course, the Pharaoh at the top of the hierarchy. Below him was nobility, consisting of the highest government officials, the prime minister, the other government official persons who did Pharaoh's business. Then, of course, there was the army that consisted of the officers and your private foot soldiers or whatever. They had a lot of horses, chariots, horsemen, charioteers. They had their priest, who was the educated people, but they also had their farmers and artisans. The artisans, the persons who made the dishes, the cups, the vases, the pottery. Again, very, very regulated, very structured. But the largest number of people, as in the case of all these ancient societies, were the farmers who worked the land, and they depended heavily on the flooding, the annual flooding, to flood the place, bring down a fresh layer of topsoil. That way, they never had to worry about wearing out the soil, depleting the soil. Topsoil was always there. All right, religion. It seems like the Egyptians had a fascination for humans with animal heads. You have your falcon-headed gods, and you have your cat-headed gods. Now, the cat, looks like a domestic house cat, was a very strong, the Egyptians seem to have a very deep fascination with the cat, believing in cats to be sacred. Some of the names of the gods are Horus, Osiris, but the main one, of course, I want to mention, Isis. We would not remember Isis except that she was later taken up by the Romans, actually by the Greeks and Romans. Alexander the Great had an affinity for Isis, and it is believed under Alexander's influence, her worship spread to the Hellenistic world. It's the world that Alexander left behind when he died, the Hellenistic world. And then the Romans took up, when they lost interest in their own Olympian gods, the Romans took up the worship of Isis. And again, believe what you will, the worship of Isis is said to have been going on secretly all down through the ages, and organizations that meet in secret and conduct their rituals in secret. And in modern times, this name keeps cropping up. Most recently, in the Middle East terror group that calls themselves ISIS. For some reason, President Obama calls them ISIL, but they're known as ISIS by themselves. And I'm sure that the original, I'm sure the people who take the name Isis have to be aware that this is the same name as the ancient Egyptian goddess. According to Egyptian folklore, Isis was the mother of all things. And in that regard, some people believe that Isis then was taken up by Christianity, where that instead of calling her Isis, the Christians called her Mary. She was the mother of, particularly of her son Osiris. When Osiris was killed, she tried to resurrect Osiris, but so she worked out a deal with another world where she would spend half of the time in the netherworld, the world of the dead, while her son was on the top, and then her son would go to the netherworld while she was in the top world. And this correlated with the season of summer and winter. When one of them, and I get mixed up which one, when one of them was on the top world, there was summer. When the other one was in the top world, there was winter. But they would take their turns about. No, they never got to see each other again because one of them was alive while the other one was dead. And this led to stories of mother-child resurrection, so on and so forth. Easter, story of Easter, the egg, the resurrection. Yeah, yes.
Wasn't there a story, and it was like where the son got killed,
Yeah.
and like he was put in like different pieces. And
Cut
she
into
had-
13 pieces.
Yeah, and she had to go
And the
find
pieces
him.
were scattered on the earth.
Yeah.
And Isis rather,
She
went
did it
around the
3
world
times.
collecting the pieces and put them back together.
And she had to do it 3 times because they kept taking them apart. That's all I remember.
Again, now this story has different variations. Personally, I think that in the Babylonian folklore, she's known as Semiramis or Ishtar, or even Inanna. Same woman with different names. In Greek folklore, possibly she's Venus. But yes, it's cut into 13 pieces, and she went around and reassembled the pieces. Again, I could spend a whole lot of time talking about it because I've done quite extensive research on it. But some of what I would tell you might not be appropriate even for an adult college class. I mean, it involves a lot of theology of the kind that, quite frankly, I do not subscribe to. I mean, well, all right, someone accused me of, hey, you're pushing these gods. I said, no, I believe in these gods the same way I believe in Adolf Hitler. Hitler was a real person, but most of his doctrine I do not subscribe to. Were these gods ever real entities that roamed the earth? I strongly suspect so. These stories then are based on certain realities, not just made up, but based on certain realities. I have to stop right there. But believe me, there's a whole lot more that I believe I could say about them. Now again, you can believe if you want to that the people, ancient people, needed some kind of mythology to explain the universe, so they invented these stories, and they invented them from their mind. You can believe that if you wish. There are persons who believe that these mythologies were a secret code that was to be passed down from generation to generation, to be understood by the initiates when the right time came. I said I would stop. I got to. All right. Yes.
Here's my theory.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
So this is what I think is going to happen, like in the future. So what happened was maybe back then, because there's no proof, maybe they had all the technology that we have now,
And more.
and there's just no way of finding anything that ever, like maybe they had electricity back then. We don't know, and maybe that's how they got it up to date. And then 200 years goes by, and no one figures it out until another smart man, Ben Franklin, I guess, right? And then figures that out, and then what happens in 300 years when there's no cars around, and then someone else, like, that's just how I think could have happened. If that even, I
But
mean,
until
yeah.
you get smart people who rediscover what they originally knew and what they originally had.
But you don't think that's possible that
Oh,
like,
yeah,
someone
yeah.
could have had electricity, and that's how they got the thing up the stairs?
Well,
And I
you
know
wait,
it
you
sounds-
wait till we get to the chapter on India. The ancients believed that they went to the planets and the stars.
See, I mean,
Yeah, in other words, it's not that, I mean, they travel to planets, set up colonies on the planets, and ruled the stars, so, and they flew, and they describe, the pictures they picture of airplanes are very similar to ours. This is in the Vedas.
See, maybe they had something like that back then.
Oh, and a whole lot of stuff that we don't have. See, they had an airplane that could fly, submerge itself underwater, and then get back up, and we don't have that.
No, we don't.
We don't, yes.
Could it also be because they didn't have like a writing system to put down everything that they discovered, so that over time they lost?
You hit something right on the head. What we have tried to do is put our knowledge in written form to where it will be passed down to the generation, because we don't know who will take it up. In other words, some man invents something, he writes down what he invented, but he doesn't know who will take it up. The Egyptians made the mistake of putting all their knowledge in the hands of their elite scholars, and all it would take would be one generation to fail to understand what their fathers, and I say fathers in a literal sense, put together. Whereas if they tried to educate everybody, if the father realized, hey, my son just doesn't have the ability to understand electric motors, so I'm going to teach the neighbor boy over here who has more aptitude than my son has. And they could have passed it down, but see, all it takes, folks, is one generation to fail to teach the next, and everything that we have is lost. And I think that's where the Egyptians went wrong. They tried to keep this knowledge secret in the hands of a few of the elite, and did not allow anyone from the outside in. They looked down on the ordinary person as being ignorant, but the fact is, since the ordinary person made up 90% of the population, some of them might have been really super brilliant. And I want to say this about in America, those of us who are Americans, whether you're white or black, whatever, most of us are descended from impoverished Africans or impoverished Europeans or even impoverished Asians. Asia's, Europe, and Africa's outcast. Look what we've become. And I'm not the least bit ashamed to tell you I'm descended from a penniless immigrant who came over here from Scotland with nothing. Am I embarrassed about that? Not in the least. In other words, they should have trained through lower classes. Because some of them would have picked up, because, I mean, let's face it, a lot of times fathers who are extremely gifted will produce children who are not. I saw at least one person kind of grinned at that, but, and as this is why a lot of empires have fallen and failed. Gifted fathers, less than gifted sons. All right. The religion of the Egyptians was polytheistic, and another feature of their religion is that the Pharaoh was looked on as being divine. Now, this is different from among the Babylonians. They did not believe their kings were divine. Now, this is something that you've run into throughout history. In India, they believed that their kings were God. The Egyptians believed their kings were God. The Babylonians did not. The Sumerians, Babylonians, as far as we know, they didn't believe their kings were God. But the Egyptians, to them, Pharaoh was God. And if you ever watched the movie The Lion King, that would have come out probably about the time some of you were being born. It depicted a long line of lion kings, and every one of them, when they died, they went into the heavens as a god. The pharaohs believed that they were from a long line of pharaohs, and each one, when he died, he became a god. We can laugh, but nevertheless, the Egyptian people would worship their long-dead pharaohs because they looked on them as being divine. Now, again, their religion was polytheistic, but we have one king named Akhenaten. I'm not going to write that down, it won't be on a test, but it is in the book. Akhenaten tried to change the religion of Egypt to monotheism, and temporarily he got all these other gods' names erased to where the only god was the god Aten, was the only one. But as soon as he died, his son undid everything he did and returned Egypt back to polytheism. Why did one Egyptian monarch experiment with monotheism? And again, folks, that's a deep subject. There are persons who believe that the house of pharaohs was influenced by a strong Hebrew influence at one time, in that a man named Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace and was educated among all with all the knowledge of the Egyptians. Again, whether Moses had any influence on Akhenaten or not, we cannot tell, because we cannot tell which Pharaoh Moses would have come in contact with, or who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Not yet. Now, some scholars believe that they know. But anyway, that brings us to another issue, the issue of the Exodus. I didn't see it, but understand there's just a new movie that's come out about this topic. There have been several movies made of it. One of them, The Ten Commandments, that was made in the 1960s, that I did one time have a copy of, but the old VCR copy faded. There was another one, Prince of Egypt, an animated cartoon, and my daughters would watch over and over and over again. Yeah, Prince of Egypt. And yeah, I happened to see any of those. No hands going. One off. Okay, two, three. Okay, 3, 4 of you. All right, yeah, Prince of Egypt. Now, here's the thing about the story of the Exodus, folk. The critics will say you cannot find any record of it in the Egyptian records. The person who made the most recent movie calls him wrong. Here's why. Again, Egyptian chronology is deliberately distorted. There are a group of letters called the Tel El Amarna letters. I'm not going to write that name down either, but the Tel El Amarna letters describe 6 of the 10 plagues almost to a T. The problem is the Tel El Amarna letters are believed to have been written about 400 or 500 years before the Exodus would have occurred. But Emmanuel Velikovsky and a few other scholars have said, no, you should put the Tel El Amarna datum right there at the time of the Exodus, and you'd find it fits to a T. Now, when I was in high school, a man who is now a college professor in Ohio, I didn't ask, the last time I saw him, I didn't ask him what he believed, because we were at his brother's funeral and it was not appropriate for me to do so. I've thought about writing him since. But he said to the whole class, that story about Pharaoh's army being drowned in the Red Sea, he said, I don't believe that. And I'm a preacher's kid. On a personal note, I'm also a preacher's kid. But I do believe the story. And here's why. Number one, you can find it in Egyptian records if you jumble up their chronology a little bit. But number two, it's the way the Hebrews kept their history, folks. They didn't confine it to a few scholars. They wrote it in a book that everybody has an opportunity to read. Now, in a Jewish synagogue today, or even in a Jewish home, they celebrate a festival called Passover every year. And during this festival, they'll look around the room and decide, now, who's the youngest person in the room? And it has to be someone old enough to talk, but the youngest person, usually some preschool child, maybe who can barely talk. They don't say, who's the oldest person? And it can't be someone who's suffering too badly from Alzheimer's, but someone who still has their mind. But maybe this young person, this preschool child, will go up to this old person who might even be sitting on a wheelchair and ask the question, why are we celebrating tonight different from other nights? And this old person will tell the group the story of the Exodus. This ceremony, I'm talking about, has been done for some 3,000 years. If any of you are Jewish, you might know even more about it than I do. They have passed this story to where I've even read works by agnostic Jews who believe it. Emmanuel Velikovsky for one, Zachariah Sitchin for another. They're both deceased, but 2 Jewish men who believe the story, but they try to find a rational explanation of what happened. But essentially, some people believe that the intermediate period, this particular second intermediate period, occurred as a result of the Exodus, the plagues described. It sent Egypt into chaos. And Egypt remained in chaos for a few hundred years, declined, and particularly after Pharaoh's army got drowned in the Red Sea, a group of men called the Hyksos came in, and they conquered Egypt, because after all, at this point, Egypt had no army. They conquered Egypt, and they ruled Egypt for a few generations, the Hyksos dynasty, before they were finally expelled. But the Egyptians had no way to expel them, because, again, there was no longer any army. It all fits, folk, except for one thing, the chronology. The events I'm describing, you talk to an Egyptian historian and say, oh no, they did not occur at the time of Moses. But there are hints, folks, of monotheistic influence in Pharaoh's palace. There are hints of big disasters that overtook Egypt, and Egypt is a land that does not experience very many natural disasters. But there are hints. All right. Anyway, in Egypt, marriages were arranged, and again, this is something that you find a lot in the ancient world. I will say this, not that I'm in any way promoting arranged marriages, but in general, arranged marriages last a lot longer and work out a lot better than marriages where the couple decides for themselves. Right? I'll leave that. No, my own marriage was not arranged. No, neither was the marriage of any of my brothers and sisters. I mean, we don't do that in the modern world. But nevertheless, they had it. Now, I showed you I think I talked last week about the picture at the bottom of page 23 where you see Egyptians, and the Egyptians are a multicolored people. Now, folks, this painting is an original painting. It's at least 3,000 years old, and it shows people who are almost white and people who are almost black. Now, the standard view is, oh no, the Egyptians mingled with the Nubians to the south, and the Nubians were black. I don't doubt that many of the Nubians were black, but if you were to ask me if you could find a Nubian picture, it would probably be just the same. That they in those days were a mixture of white and black. A lot of ancient art depicts humanity the same way this picture is, a mixture of white and black, indicating that there was, the same couple would produce one white child, and the next child might be black, and the next child might be something in between. They had that ability. That's since then, because our genes we have fewer genes than they did, we have lost this ability. Most white couples only produce white children. Now, there are some exceptions. Most black couples only produce black children. Again, there are some exceptions. Now, your book says these black people are Nubians. Be that as it may, there are other pictures I've seen that do not tend to bear this out. All right. Moving on from Egypt for a while to Indo-Europeans. Now, we wonder how much the Near Easterners and the Egyptians influenced the Indo-Europeans. Of course, the Indo-Europeans are people who lived in Europe. And what we do know is that in the region of the Caucasian Mountains, that is a region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, but just to the north of both, the book shows a map on page 25, Indo-Europeans spread out, and one group of them went south and became the Persians, so they conquered Persia and then went into India. The Aryans went into India, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. The Medes and Persians settled in Persia, while their relatives, the Aryans, went on to India. And then a group of them spread out also and became the Hellenes, or the Greeks. We call them the Greeks, but they were Hellenic peoples. The group of them spread out into the Baltic region, and a group of them spread out into Europe and settled in Britain and in Italy. The Latins settled in Italy. The Italic peoples settled in Italy. We'll be visiting these people later, but they were all Indo-European people. Now, as was the case of the Egyptians, the Indo-European people seem to have a fascination for stone. Now, the most famous stone structure is Stonehenge, located in England. The stones in the Stonehenge were arranged in such a way that on Midsummer Day, the stones would form a circle in the middle of the Stonehenge. But it is known that these stones were moved maybe one or two times since they were initially put in place, that they somehow had to do some shifting. Why would they have had to do any shifting of these stones again? You can speculate that the earth shifted on its axis if you want to. Another thing about the Stonehenge, folk, is the stones are too large to have been moved. Now, there have been books. Now, again, if you read something different, I'll welcome your comments, but there are persons who said that the stones that make up the Stonehenge were quarried in Ireland and then somehow transported from Ireland to England and set up in England. Now, no wooden vessel could carry any one of those stones. No wooden vessel that we know of, anyway, could carry them. So how were the stones transported? And we know for sure they were not quarried right there at the site where they are. So even if they were not quarried in Ireland, and Ireland is a separate island from England, you may know, even if they were not quarried in Ireland, the problem becomes how were these stones transported from wherever they were quarried to where they're located. And again, folk, we do not really have a rational explanation. The Stonehenge is just one of 10,000 stone structures. And yes, I have a book in the house about the stone structure of Europe, and it deliberately left out the Stonehenge. That you can find the information on it. It's too well known anyway. But it told about more than 1,000 of these stone buildings that nobody knows who built. It's just that ever since the dawn of history, the earliest structure, they were always there. They've not been inhabited. I mean, even though they were meant to be inhabited. I mean, there were stone structures with walls and doors and even a window. The roof has since rotted or decayed away. The roof was probably made of wood. And nobody has bothered to fix them up, repair them, restore them, or live in them again. But stone structures that are all over Europe, and nobody knows who built or why, or even when. Megaliths, your book called them. The word megalith is a Greek word meaning large stone. Your book says that radiocarbon dating shows that they were built around 4000 BCE, long before even the pyramids were built in Egypt. Again, folk, it's strong, strong evidence that the farther back in history you go, the more advanced they become. And this is backwards from what we're used to thinking. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, the car I'm driving today is far better than any car that my dad drove. I mean, in the case of my dad, I mean, you know, this month it's a universal joint. Some of you might not even know what a universal joint is. Next month it's a couple of tires. Then the month after that it's the muffler. Then it's a headlamp. And that was cheap, I mean, relatively. Then after the headlamp, it would be a gear tooth broken off the transmission. Well, that called for taking the transmission apart and replacing a couple of the gears. Then next month, it would be a wheel bearing. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Today's cars are much, much more precisely built with much, much better materials and much, much better. But they had to, I mean, when I was young, my dad had to repair the car. There was something breaking about it every month. And new cars were not necessarily all that much better. Within a year, they had to have some kind of repair. Today's cars can get 200, 300,000, 400,000 miles without touching the engine. It has been done, 400,000. There have been a few. Again, better. Yes?
So as far as like these structures and things that, you know, the further back you go, the more complicated they are.
Yes.
Shouldn't the explanation be that the further back you go, the more religious people are? So
The more what?
religious people are. And the further back you go, you have these incredibly devoted people who are willing to go to any length to, in their minds.
You've got a really good point. That religion might have been the motivating factor. There's no doubt that the farther back you go, the more religious they were. These people were extremely religious.
Yeah.
And you don't find, until the time of the Greeks, only with the Greeks do you finally find skeptics. But it's like, and people are speculating, why don't you find any kind of religious skepticism in the ancient world? Well, if you believe the sun is God, I mean, at least the sun exists. And if you believe the river is God, well, hey, the river at least does exist. But again, they were extremely religious. And of course, you have an entity living in a temple who's mightier and stronger than you are. I mean, real live entity and who has children by some of your women. I mean, the ancients actually believed this, folk. I can't prove it actually happened, but I can prove that the ancients believed it. A real flesh and blood entity that's stronger than you. It might not be hard to believe that the gods are real because, after all, they have a living presence in your temple. But you don't find religious skeptics in the ancient world, and they were. And again, I strongly believe that they had more physical abilities and more mental capacity than we do. And they had mastered a secret of moving stones that we, for the most part, have not mastered. All right, I'll tell you. Any of you ever seen or heard of the Coral Gables mansion in Florida? All right, it's a real place. According to the story, there was a certain truck driver who was running out of money and didn't have a job. And one day, this owner of a certain place said, "Hey, you have a truck. I want you to go to this quarry where they quarry stone and pick up these stones. When you come here, leave your trailer behind and come back the next one with the trailer." But this man did this for years, and he actually got fairly wealthy because he had regular steady income. Go to the quarry, pick up the stones from the quarry, and he dropped the stones off in the evening. The next morning, all of his stones would be off the truck and on the castle. We don't know how the builder moved them. No idea. But he built the Coral Gables Castle, which, again, you can look it up for yourself. One of you apparently has seen it. I have not been there myself, but I have read about it. We don't know how he moved the stones, but he put the stones in place, all to impress his girlfriend. And again, some people today might know the secret, but they apparently had a means of moving stones that somewhere along the way we have forgotten. Your book pictures the Indo-European people as being nomadic. The word nomad means wandering herdsmen, people who follow the herds from place to place. Now, I don't doubt that Europeans became that folk. I don't believe that's what they were at the beginning, but nevertheless, that's what they became. They'd wake up in the morning and try to figure out which way the herds were going, and they'd follow the herds. Among the very ancient nomads you have cave paintings. Now, this is where you go deep inside some of the caves, particularly in France, and you find artwork on the side. The artwork is fairly high-quality artwork, made with high-quality oil paints that have withstood the dampness of the caves for millennia. Now, the big trick, though, is what they pictured. They pictured their hunting episodes, and among the animals they hunted were the woolly mammoths. Well, they said, oh, these mammoths didn't exist in France, never did. Well, now they've found that the woolly mammoth did, in fact, exist in France. And when we've actually found some, not live woolly mammoths, but some woolly mammoths in a remarkably good state of preservation, having been frozen in Siberia, we realized these people were really good artists. But they depicted hunting and killing the woolly mammoth, bringing part of their cave painting. Now, folk, I keep referring to the books I have in my house. I have another one that says that they also have shown a fight between a dinosaur and a woolly mammoth. I'm not going to put that on a test, but nevertheless, the book's there. But that this painting, you're not allowed to see because the French government has deliberately tried to cover it up, and it's very difficult to get into to see it. But nevertheless, there is such a painting that depicts a dragon. Call it a dragon, call it a dinosaur, call it what you will. But these people apparently believed in dragons also. Now, there were the Hittites. These were people that we knew nothing about until recent times. Their memory was lost to history, except the Bible mentioned them. And a lot of scholars would say, hey, that shows the Bible was a group of fairy tales and mythologies because there are no Hittites. But eventually we found that not only did the Hittites exist, but a Hittite king went into the city of Babylon one day and sacked Babylon and destroyed Hammurabi's empire. Hammurabi was himself dead. But under Hammurabi's grandson, the Hittite empire was the Hittite Empire destroyed the Babylonian Empire, and it took 1,000 years for Babylon to recover. Babylon eventually did recover, as we'll find out later. The Hittite king's name, and no, I'm not going to write it down. The king's name was Shupalulumas. I learned that name when I was in graduate school because we had to. But if you take third year world history, and folks, they might start teaching it now that we're part of Georgia State, they might start teaching Near Eastern history on a third year level, junior level, even senior level. You'd go into much more detail about each of these. As part of my preparation for master's, I had to read a book on the Hittites written by Gurney, and they went through a period of extreme strength and hegemony and spread out, and then they declined. The Hittites were the first group of people to make use of iron. This I want you to remember, folk, because it's led to what we call the Iron Age. And eventually iron was made into steel. You mix iron with magnesium and sometimes a few other metals, and you can make steel. And iron and steel are a big, big part of the modern world. Iron weapons gave them an advantage over persons who were using stone or copper weapons. Iron is harder, can hold a point better, can be used to drive nails much better than a copper nail, so on and so forth. All right, the Phoenicians. First thing I want to mention about the Phoenicians is from that word we get the word phonics or phonetics. The Phoenicians invented the alphabet that most of Europe uses today. Instead of writing in hieroglyphics where you had to learn thousands of symbols, or cuneiform where you had to learn thousands of symbols also, the Phoenician alphabet only had, I believe, 22 symbols, not the 26 we have today. And they began their alphabet, of course, is pretty much the same alphabetical order we have today, with the letter A and B and C and so forth. The Romans and Greeks took up the Phoenician alphabet. Now, it is known now, we'll talk about this when we come to chapter 4, the Greeks originally wrote on another kind of script, but then they borrowed the Phoenician alphabet from the Phoenicians. They decided the Phoenician alphabet was better, so they began writing using the Phoenician alphabet. And most of what we know about Greek history then comes from their writing with the Phoenician alphabet. They were the ones who invented the letters that are used by almost all Western European peoples today. Now, the Phoenicians were Semitic. Now, I want to say that tongue-in-cheek. I mean, there's no doubt that the Phoenician language was Semitic. But some people have said that racially they might not have been Semitic because maybe their ancestor grew up as a slave in a Semite's household and learned to speak a Semitic tongue. And that's why, that even though they were not Semitic themselves, they spoke a Semitic tongue. But nevertheless, they did speak a Semitic tongue. They're famous, though, for being seagoers. Their home was in what is today Israel, but it's actually farther north than Israel proper. It's located between Israel and Syria. The cities of Tyre and Sidon, don't worry about the names. But they were a seagoing people. From the Mediterranean Sea, they spread out and spread throughout the Mediterranean. Now, folk, I just said they spread throughout the Mediterranean. There have been scholars who claim that they find Phoenician artifacts in the Amazon area of Brazil, in Minnesota. Phoenician artifacts are said to have been found in places like Java. I'm talking about now the Far East. Some people believe that these Phoenician sailors sailed all over the globe, all the way around Africa, all the way to the Far East, all the way to the Americas. Be that as it may, There are persons who insist that they found Phoenician artifacts, but other persons will criticize that. And well, I'll put it this way: my graduate professor said it just seemed to him to be fantastic. It doesn't seem that way to me, but nevertheless, that was how he dismissed it. He did not disprove it. He just simply dismissed the story as being fantastic. Anyway, we do know that they went all the way to Spain, and possibly they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and went into Britain, and maybe down the coast of Africa a little bit. The city of Carthage, which we'll talk about later, started out as a Phoenician colony. Carthage was remembered for its long wars that it fought against Rome that they lost. So keep the Phoenicians in mind. Like I say, the Greeks took up their alphabet, and then the Romans took it up, but the Romans made some changes to it. The Greek letters look something like this, or actually, I believe it should be written this way. These are Greek letters. Yeah, here's another Greek letter. The Romans, what we're using is, in the modern world, is mostly the Latin alphabet, which was a copy, or you might even say a corruption of the Phoenician alphabet. All right, which takes me up to the Hebrews, children of Israel. And folk, I really don't have time. I'm going to start on them anyway. Essentially, folk, the children of Israel claimed, like all ancient peoples, that they were descended from one man, Abraham. And then he had a son named Isaac and a son named Jacob, and Jacob was the father of the 12 different tribes of Israel. Now, recently, I did some research on Abraham, and somebody said, well, Abraham did not exist. Just dismissed it outright. Well, folk, I want to tell you something logically. Anybody who's in this room had an ancestor who lived in 1800 BC. If you didn't, you're not here. You see the logic? I mean, if you didn't have a living ancestor who had children in 1800 BCE, that's about the time Abraham would live. So, well, if Abraham didn't exist, then none of the people who claim to be descended from him can exist either. But anyway, that's the logic that they used. And in fact, I actually initially intended to use that on the paper I assigned as an example of what I'd call bad logic. And I thought, no, it's too controversial, but initially. By the way, I mean, I hope that you have begun to look at the paper and might be starting to make the corrections on it. It's due quicker than you think. Anyway, according to the story, Abraham was a wandering herdsman. Started off in the city of Ur, which makes him a Sumerian because of Sumerian. He got out of the city of Ur before Ur was destroyed. And he eventually died, and his descendants found their way to Egypt during a period of famine. Now, famines were a big part of the ancient world before they had our means of transportation. I mean, we have periods where sometimes we have bad years where the corn doesn't grow in a certain locality, but then again we'll find corn in another place. I remember several years ago that the people of Iowa had a really, really bad year, and where my relatives live in Ohio, they almost had a bad year, but not because of lack of rain. They had too much rain. And they had so much rain they couldn't plow because it was soggy. And finally, the one day they had was the opening, was a Sunday. So they all got out on Sunday and plowed their garden, with big gardens, because they had to. It was the only day they had. They could not plow a soggy, wet, muddy field. But they finally got their plowing in just in time. If you don't get the plowing in time, you can't have a crop. I mean, there was just a small window of opportunity. But anyway, they had a period of famine, and during the famine they went to Egypt. And they remained in Egypt 400 years, and eventually they were enslaved in Egypt. And then, with help of divine providence, according to their account, they got out of Egypt and went into the wilderness. The man who led them out of Egypt was Moses. And among black Americans, during the time of their enslavement, Moses was a very popular figure among slaves in America. And anyone can guess why. Because in the Bible, Moses freed the slaves.